Good day. Welcome to our webinar on super flexibility and resilience, leading in turbulent times, with Professor Homa Bahrami, who you can see on the screen right now. We thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us for this webinar. I realize a lot of you might actually be having kids, kind of running around in the background. They're welcome to join us on this conversation that we're going to be having today. And we do hope that it is a conversation, and so that this will be an opportunity for you to take a little bit of time out of the day to really talk to what is a fabulous guest and get her insights and perspectives on what we're all going through in this moment. And you can find a lot of different resources that we have about virtual learning. Obviously, there's an acceleration of the trend to virtual learning in this moment, as well as other additional resources on leadership, from some of our star faculty like Homa Bahrami, and then also some additional resources that we're providing for HR and L&D. And just to give you a quick sense, we have another webinar with Dory Clark on virtual uncertainty. There's a recording on the website around that, as well as a second wave legal implications of COVID-19. We have a lawyer from Gibson Dunn, Jason Schwartz, and Melody Jones from CEB, who I talked to on a podcast about that and kind of provide some additional information on the legal implications of COVID-19. We will be continuing to update all of that information, as we go forward, and want to provide our clients and prospects and listeners with some thought leadership as you're moving through this crisis. So let me do some introductions. So I am Adam Briniger. I run client solutions here at ExecOnline, and very excited to moderate this conversation with Homa Bahrami. So let me read a little bit about Homa, the star of the show. She is an international educator, advisor, board member, and author, specializing in organizational flexibility, team alignment, and dynamic leadership in global knowledge-based industries. She is a senior lecturer at the Haas School of Business, University of California, Berkeley, a faculty director at the Haas Center for Executive Education, and on the board of the Haas Center for Teaching Excellence. She has a new book, Super Flexibility, for knowledge enterprises, which focuses on practical approaches for strategizing, organizing, and leading knowledge workers based on their collective experience in field research in Silicon Valley during the last 30 years. She is also the star of our program that we do with Berkeley called Accelerating Change, Readiness, and Agility. The next certificate program will be launching on April 27th. And so, an opportunity to continue to learn from Homa there. But want to provide have a warm welcome to Homa and have her kick us off. I would say as we get started, we definitely want this to be a conversation. So as you have questions for Homa, please enter them into the chat box. Feel free to interrupt as we go forward. Anything that you want to know about change, about managing change at the organization, Homa's the right person to ask, and feel free to start bringing in those questions right away. So over to you, Homa, to walk through your material.
Thank you so much, Adam, and hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know this is such an unprecedented time for all of us, so really appreciate you taking time out of your hectic schedule, juggling different priorities, kids, home, work, to join us. I just want to give you a little context about my work so you better understand where I'm coming from. I did my PhD work back in the UK looking at large multinational corporations, companies like Shell, BP, Cadbury, Schweppes, and so on, and how their organizational systems adapted and adjusted as they experienced different kinds of change. I won't bore you with the details of that, but just want to give you some context. Then I came over here to go to Stanford Business School as a postdoc, and this was the 1980s. This was a time when Silicon Valley was just taking off the ground. Apple was a few years old. Oracle was 4 or 5 years old. I remember Cisco being founded. The IT manager at Stanford who gave me my first email account went on to become the co-founder of Cisco. So I had a real opportunity to look at the rise of this new age companies and compare them with the old style. organizations that I had studied back in the UK as part of my PhD work. And the point I want to make is the biggest difference between the two worlds was this constant adaptation and flexibility and dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So I became a student of how do you lead, how do you organize, how do you manage when everything is in flux? Because in Silicon Valley, technologies change, competition changes, new startups come about, business models change. Everything is in a constant state of evolution. So that became the basis for a lot of my research and advisory work and teaching. I just wanted to give you that context because this slide really represents the world we've come from, the world of yesterday, which is what we call industrial age thinking, and the world of today and tomorrow, which is really characterized by change as a constant. Of course, the biggest difference between the world before coronavirus and after coronavirus is that before coronavirus, I would suggest businesses were trying to reinvent themselves. Organizations were trying to reinvent themselves. This is the whole theme of, for example, digital transformation. But what Corona did, which I think was a total game changer, is made this change extremely personal. It is not just your company that's got to change. It's not just your processes or the products your company sells that have to adapt and evolve. It's you as a human being have to get used to a new way of working. So think about it, kids at home, can't, gather in crowds. Just think about the whole fabric of our social life has changed. And this is one of the reasons that, we wanted to have this webinar with you to just share with you some lessons learned from this research, and hopefully you can apply that at both the individual level, your personal level, and at your team and organizational level. So when we look at uncertainty and turbulence, at least in this context, we tend to look at 4 different types of risk. We look at team risk, some of the key star players with crucial capabilities leave a massive hole. How do we deal with that? Financial risk, we've lost market share. We can't keep operating as we have done before. I'm sure this is something many of our organizations are going to have to grapple with after the crisis. Market risk, competition has changed. New products have been introduced. Technology has changed the way we sell our product. And of course, what Corona has done, which is what I call context risk. The entire context within which we operate has changed. So just to share with you, these are some of the key risks that we tend to think about. And of course, it's like peeling an onion. There's multiple levels of risk, and you have the context risk is, of course, at a meta level. It's at the 30,000-foot level that impacts everything that we do. So change has become a constant, but as human beings, we do not like change and uncertainty. We like predictability. We're creatures of habit. We like our routine. We like to be in control. So what are the biggest barriers that as human beings we feel we have for change? One is, of course, the most important one is mindset, attitude, and habits. And there is nothing like a crisis to force us to change our habits. We find 99% of people, organizations only change when they have to. The famous saying, necessity is the mother of invention. The other kind of barriers have to do with our incentive system. The way that we think, our culture has been developed. If it's been developed in an old style industry, it's been around for a long time, our leadership team has come through a particular set of experiences, then of course that's also going to be a barrier to change because there's a learning curve involved in picking up new habits, new routines, new cultural themes. And of course, last by no means least is our approach. And as human beings in the last 50 years in our industrial age organizations, we are used to perfection. We want everything to be perfect. And of course, one of the things about living in a world of constant change is we cannot be perfect. Good enough is good enough. And this is what we see a lot with successful innovators, is they try things out. Some of these things work out, some of them don't. And they learn from those experiences and they move on. So 3 key barriers are habits at a personal level, our incentive systems and culture at an organizational level, and then our processes, our approaches to solving problems with a perfectionist tendency. So now I'd love to hear from you and see what's on your mind, because each one of us will experience change in a different way. And I know some of you have sent some questions in ahead of time, and we're going to address those in a minute. I wanted to just share with you something about a crisis. We have got a lot of knowledge about crisis. Of course, Corona is an unprecedented crisis because it's impacting everybody, everywhere, every industry. But crises generally go through 3 distinctive phases. Phase 1, which is before the crisis actually hits, is what we call sense and prepare. We live in California, and in California, of course, is earthquake country. And sense and prepare is to think about eventualities of a catastrophe ahead of time. So, for example, if you come to my home, you will find that in order to prepare, and we hope that the crisis of an earthquake doesn't hit us, but we have to be prepared. You find that I've got dry food, I've got a radio with batteries in case there's no internet. We have our heating system, strapped to the wall in case there's shaking and we don't want, a gas explosion. We have spare water, spare food. So you want to have some sense of preparation before a crisis. That's when you have the maximum flexibility. Of course, in the case of Corona, it hit us so suddenly. I think we basically aren't prepared. So if you think about it, back in January, we knew it was hitting China, was hitting part of Asia, but we didn't think it would transmit so quickly to, say, the United States or other parts of the world. But this is phase 1. And phase 1 is about sensing and preparing. Of course, the more advance notice you have, the more you can prepare. Right now, we're in the middle of the crisis. This is during the crisis. This is the time when we've got to engage and act. This is a time when we've got to take it one day at a time. We've got to go for, salvaging what we can. We've got to focus on what is within our control. And I'll come to some of those best practices in a moment. But this is the time when we find constant communication, keeping in touch with one another, short deadlines, clear deliverables to keep the team engaged. These are things that become really, really important. And then, of course, we have what happens after the crisis. How do we recover? How do we regroup? The biggest challenge we have with Corona, I think, is we don't know when it'll end. If you have a hurricane, if you have a fire, if you have a flood, if you have a natural catastrophe as a crisis, there is a time limit to it. You say the hurricane will pass within the next 3 days, it'll weaken. The fire will burn out in the next couple of weeks. But with this situation, one of the biggest problems that people have is that we don't know when. And I think this is something that I hear a lot of people are basically struggling with. Next slide, please. So with that background and just some sort of context setting, I'd like us to hear from you and just see what are some of the key pain points that you are dealing with, whether it's on an individual level, working from home, whether it's at the team level, whether it's at a company level. Would love to hear from as many of you as possible. And Adam, I think you're monitoring if there are any.
I am monitoring, Homa. Thank you for that introduction. So we've got a question. We've got a couple questions coming through. First question, what role does personal resilience play in how executives lead in this uncertain and complex time? What does this resilience look like?
Personal resilience is critical. There is no such thing as organizational or team resilience, in my opinion, without personal resilience. So this is one of the things I'm going to wrap up today with, is some tips for you to consider. As a leader, you are a mood generator. Just like as a parent, your mood at home impacts your children. So personal resilience is the key to success. Do you see the glass as half full, or do you see it as half empty? Do you panic and go into a victim mode, or do you think more like a driver and start thinking about doing things within your control? So personal resilience is about 2 or 3 things, and we'll wrap up with that, but let me address your question very sort of briefly. One is take it a day at a time. Don't try to guess the end result. Take it a day at a time. Secondly, take baby steps. As human beings, we like action and we like control. And if you take baby steps and do something, even if it's something very small, you find that it makes a huge difference. I, for example, because of the fact that all of our classes have moved online, all of our in-person meetings have been cancelled, all of the travel has stopped, I've got more time on my hands. So how am I leveraging that? So I'm leveraging it by doing a little bit more thinking and writing, which quite frankly, I didn't have time to do. So I'm just carving out a couple of hours each day and say, use your time to think. Produce something at the end. It might be a couple of pages. It might be a couple of ideas, but that makes me feel better. And even at home, I have started doing more spring cleaning. I'm cleaning up the garage, the extra time that I have. And I can't tell you how much better it makes me feel when I feel that I've done something. I'm connecting with friends that I haven't connected with for a long time. And, every day I make it a point to contact one friend and have a Skype or a phone conversation with them, something live that connects us as human beings on an emotional level. I'm just giving you some of those personal examples because you talk about personal resilience, and I think it's all about mindset. Do you see the glass as half full? Do you see it as half empty? Do you say it could have been a lot worse? I could be massively sick, and I could have cancer. I could have life-threatening disease. Right now, at least for the time being, we're okay. So the way you think is really important. And secondly, what are the signals you send to your team? Do you start each virtual meeting by saying, oh my goodness, I'm not sure what's going to happen? Or do you start each virtual meeting each day by saying, okay, team, these are 3 things that we need to do today, and who would like to do what? Let's brainstorm and see how we want to move forward. So it's a great question. But I think it's really about how, as individuals, what kind of a mindset we have. Just to wrap up on this, one CEO I know in a biotech company, and biotech as an industry has a lot of risk. As you know, you invest huge amounts of money in trying to see if a drug works or not, and it's like a lottery, and a lot of time, of course, it doesn't work. So you've lost all that investment. And he said, when things are going badly for us, I am a cheerleader. When things are going very well for us, I'm a devil's advocate because I don't want my team to become too comfortable, too arrogant, too overconfident. So I hope that just sort of sums up the importance of mood generation and seeing the glass half full and taking simple steps every day to kind of make a little progress. Thank you, Adam. And whoever asked that question, it was a great question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and there's additional questions sort of around this theme, and we've got a lot of different questions in there. One from Catherine, who basically finding it hard to separate work and personal life, when work is always sort of at home now. Any kind of to this theme of personal resilience, making sure you're kind of taking care of yourself first as a leader. Any additional kind of thoughts or recommendations? I know I'm feeling that too. So I think we're all feeling that right now.
Suggest set up a virtual routine for yourself, Catherine. So what does that mean? I'll give you an example. I was speaking to a former student of mine She is working for a software company in San Francisco and leading a global team scattered all over the world. And I was speaking to her the other day, and she said, I have set up my virtual routine, which is my virtual routine at home and my virtual routine with my team. So my virtual routine at home is that I have allocated sort of work times, because as human beings, we cannot sit in front of a screen and work from 8 to 5. When you've got a couple of kids running around, when you're in your home environment, you may not have a separate home office, for example, you may not have the right infrastructure. Virtual routine means give yourself block of work time, which we call focus sprints. So say, I'm going to be available for virtual meetings between 8 and 11, and I'm going to be off between 11 and 1 because that's when my kids need help, and then I'm going to be back on between 1 and 3, and then back on between 7 and 9 at night when they've gone to bed. This is in the case of those of you that have got, you know, young kids and they're home, and of course you've got to deal with that. And virtual routine basically means look at your calendar and block off times that are your focus sprint time, which is for thinking work, block off time when you're available for meetings and one-on-ones and other related activities that involve colleagues, and block off time that is for you. It could be going for a walk in the middle of the day just to clear your head. It could be taking care of your kids for a couple of hours in the middle of the day because your partner may not be available, and that may be a time that doesn't work for them. So sort of segment your day, because we do need a routine, we do need a weekly routine, and we need a daily routine. Don't just wake up every day and say, okay, what am I going to do today? I need to do the laundry, I need to do some cooking, I need to take care of the kids, I need to show up at these 2 meetings. Bucketize your time and be very proactive about that, Catherine. Don't let others drive it. For example, if somebody says, we need you to jump on a call at 7 a.m. and you cannot jump on a call, just say, I won't be able to do anything between 7 and 9 because I've got young kids, but I can, you know, join it after 9 o'clock. Be proactive. So this is at an individual level. And, you know, so the student of mine, just to wrap up on that, said at 7:30 every morning, I start my meetings because I've got a global team, and I basically work on my team meetings and one-on-ones till noon. And then at noon, it's an hour, I'm just going to take off. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to, you know, just cook. I'm going to do something that is not work related. And then at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, my partner and I have a virtual happy hour, which is when we put on the music, and this is a signal that this is time to shut down and start cooking or whatever. Now that is Claire's, you know, virtual routine. That works for her. She doesn't have children. It's just herself and her partner. They live in a small apartment. They're both working from home. So this is what works for them. For you, it may be something else. Virtual routine. And then secondly, develop a virtual routine with your team. Get together as a team and say, how do we like to operate? When should we have our team meetings? When should we have our one-on-ones? When should we have our, you know, and by the way, when you're dealing with your team, I really suggest more frequent interaction. So for example, have a team meeting on a Monday, have a team meeting on a Friday. Instead of just once a week, have it twice a week. Have regular office hours in the middle of the week so your team knows you're available and they can reach out to you. They may not reach out to you, they may not need anything, but they know that time is there. So predictability, both for yourself and your team, is really, really critical. Don't just get up and say, what am I going to do today? That is kind of soul destroying. After a few days, it'll get to you.
Yeah, I love this advice on predictable routines and virtual happy hours. I think I might want to implement the virtual happy hour. I've got a lot more questions. Kind of moving from, and I think this was a nice segue where you kind of landed on virtual routine for teams. And so a lot of questions are kind of coming in around, you know, keeping the team engaged and motivated in a virtual environment. A lot of our managers aren't used to virtual environments, so how are we going to be able to really, sort of make that a point? Another person asked very specifically as well around micro, how do we, again, this kind of gets back to like the virtual, management piece is like, our managers are used to maybe a little bit more oversight than they can have, some more of the micromanaging. So any kind of recommendations or thoughts about, that team management piece, and how do we take people who aren't used to this and get them to, so that they kind of hit the, what are sort of the critical sort of things we need to get right now, which is continuing productivity and engagement and customer service and all the things that we still want to be able to achieve with our team.
It's a great question. So number one, be honest with your team and listen. So I suggest once a week at least during your team meetings, you start by talking about how are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 10. Adam, as a team member, where are you at? Are you at 1, which means I feel pretty depressed and down? Am I at an 8 when I feel, I'm okay and, I view this as an opportunity to do things I've never done? So step number 1, make sure you have some opportunity to take the pulse of your team and listen and empathize. This does not mean you've got to listen to sort of a victim mode all the time, but I think it's very important to acknowledge that people are suffering today from 3 sets of problems, including me. There's psychological anxiety. What's going to happen? How long will this last? What's going to happen to my job, to my routine? There is a health anxiety. Oh my goodness, I've woken up this morning. Do I have a slight fever? I felt I had a little dry cough. Have I got corona? So there is that health anxiety, and there is a longer term sort of economic anxiety. We look at the stock market and we say, oh my God, what's happened to my 401k? So number 1, you need to take the pulse of your team and do it in an empathetic way. But then once you've done that, move to step number 2, which is come up with concrete to-do list and deliverables that they can be engaged with and work on. Because as human beings, number 1, we want to be heard, we want to be empathized with. So that's your step 1. But step number 2, we want to do, we want to engage, we want to be in control, we want to produce results, we want to have an impact. And the more specific you can be with your team about your expectations about deliverables and engage them in the conversation. These are 5 key deliverables we've got to produce by the middle of next month. Now, I'm curious, which one do you want to start with? What's going to work for you this week? The more concrete you can be and clear you can be about deliverables, that enables them to be empowered and go and act, the better it's going to be. So that is issue number 2, deliverables conversation, and these should be micro deliverables. Don't go for sort of big bang deliverables. Break it up into bite-sized pieces. So by the end of the week, I can feel I did something, I produced something. That is a really, really important point, because when you're working in an office, we're not so crystal clear about deliverables, because we can chat to each other, we can have hallway conversations, but you don't have that luxury as much. So you need to be absolutely crystal clear. And number 3, celebrate success. That's why I like you to have a team meeting on a Friday at the end of the week and look back as a team and celebrate what you have achieved. It's great, team. We have had 5 different deliverables we produced this week. Those deliverables may not have been monumental. They might not be life-changing. But look, they are concrete deliverables. So make sure you celebrate those successes. I would say, and then number 4, as a team leader, go back to the routine. Make sure you have those clear stakes in the ground, that the team knows exactly when you're going to engage together. I recommend a team meeting every Monday to kick off the week, a team meeting every Friday to close the week and celebrate successes. As a leader, I suggest you have an office hour midweek which is an opportunity for the team to ask you whatever they want. It's a time you're available virtually. They may not contact you, they may not need anything, but hey, you're giving them that opportunity. And I really recommend, and I know this sounds kind of controversial, daily one-on-ones. I mean, unless you have 50 team members and you can't do that. If you have, let's say, 5, 6, 7 team members, you will find that that daily check-in really helps. It may last for 10 minutes, but it just gives them an opportunity to ask you questions, to ask you for guidance. And this stops you micromanaging. Because what you don't want is you don't want to be unpredictable and just email them and say, oh, Adam, how's it going? I'm just wondering how you're coming on with that deliverable. If I know that every day I'm going to have a 10 a.m. one-on-one with Adam, I can bring up my questions. I can sort of explore issues that are on my mind without feeling that I'm being looked over. We find at a time like this, predictability in a very unpredictable environment is crucial. So be predictable with your very concrete tasks. Be predictable with your deliverables. Be predictable with your routines, including your meetings, one-on-ones, and office hours. And absolutely make sure that you acknowledge, empathize, listen to their concerns. And to the extent that you can, don't try to say, oh, everything will be great, don't worry about it. Let them express their fears. Perhaps I've just bought a house and, I've taken on a big mortgage, assuming that the job market will continue and I'm going to have a great job and a bonus this year. And, I may be really concerned about whether I can make that mortgage or not. Make sure that you get to the bottom of some of their fears. And that's what I like about the one-on-ones, because I just think it gives you an opportunity to really dig deep into each human being, each team member's concerns at a personal level and not just, regarding deliverables, which is more at the team level. So those are some of the sort of concrete things that I think would really help.
Great, thanks, Homa. And I love the predictability point, and it's as you went through all of the, I was writing it down, and I think predictability is makes a lot of sense. We got another question that is along this vein, but sort of a nuance on it, which I think a number of people are probably feeling, and this is coming from someone who manages a team at a company, and the team is deemed essential. So their team performs duties that they're unable to perform from home and need to work from the office. And as their manager, I have been asked to work from home. And so I feel guilty about them, still working business as usual while I'm at home, safe and sound, working. And you can understand the feeling here. So what are some steps that I can take to still support them and kind of let them know that I haven't abandoned them? If
Adam, the question is that the manager is working from home, but the team members are at work because they're essential, operational reasons, essential reasons.
Yeah.
I would suggest, number one, be upfront and say that, acknowledge it. There are 3 things that we're not very good at doing as leaders. One is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement means that I say to you, Adam, I'm feeling really guilty about you being there and me being at home. And I want to make sure I can do whatever it takes to help you. What do you think you would like me to do? How can I best help? So acknowledge your feelings. Don't be shy about it. It's not going to make you a lesser leader. Being vulnerable, being open is a hallmark of trust and credibility. So use it. Historically, we've not done that. We've said, well, as a leader, I've got to come across as, I know everything. So acknowledgement is certainly very important. Secondly, pull, don't push. Don't feel you've got to have all the answers. Ask them, how can I help you? What can I do to support you? Perhaps something you can do, for example, to help them with their family situation. I don't know. I'm not, perhaps they've got, something that, is outside of the immediate work. They've got aging parents and they say, I really need to keep an eye on them, and I won't be able to do that during the day. So is it possible for you to sort of help me out by giving me a break in the middle of the day so I can do that? So be inclusive. The other thing about being predictable, the second theme that is really important is be inclusive. And being inclusive means ask them how you can help them. So A, acknowledge it. B, ask, don't feel that you've got to come up with an answer. And C, praise and recognize their contribution. Just say, look, I really appreciate what you're doing. I know it's difficult for you to be there, but you're a critical care worker. And, we so appreciate what you're doing. Make sure that their contribution is framed in a way that they realize they're making a real difference. And you, as their manager, is acknowledging and recognizing that contribution. Because remember, at the end of the day, this is about the heart. It's not about the head. It's about how do you make your people feel? Are you a caring, supportive manager? Or are you somebody who just sort of sits there quietly feeling guilty, but they don't know that you feel guilty? They don't know that you're there to help them. So I would say the word inclusive, be inclusive, and bring them into your world and make sure that they get that recognition and acknowledgement that they deserve. Don't overdo the recognition, but I think it's really, really important to do it. Because again, this is something as human beings we all value.
Yep, great. Keep bringing the questions in. I think we can move. I want to make sure that we hit on some of the questions that came before.
Adam, because we had some questions as well that came in before this session.
That's right. So let's start with the first one around adaptive culture, and I think a lot of folks on the line probably feel this. They maybe had been putting their leaders through programs, trying to build up the adaptive kind of muscle within their organization. But one of the questions that we got was, I would have not have said that we had a particularly adaptive culture heading into this crisis. So what are we going to do to build one? So now we've got to be adaptive. What can we do here?
So there are three things that you can do to do that. Number one, I really recommend, depending on your role, and I don't have more context, but create small, if you can, cross-functional teams and get them to work on different aspects of the business. So for example, let's take a regular company, and let's say you are the CEO. You may want to put together 5 teams. One team looks at, how we're going to spring clean our supply chain strategy. Another team that focuses on how we're going to spring clean our human resource and learning and development strategy. Another team that focuses on how we're going to simplify 5 of our top processes. Another team that is focusing on what's going to happen to our business model post-crisis. So I'm a big believer in creating small cross-functional teams that are focused on spring cleaning different aspects of the business and not just assuming that, there's a famous expression which says, don't let a good crisis go to waste. This is a great opportunity to spring clean, how you can improve the way you operate. And by spring clean, I mean, what are we going to stop doing? What are we going to stop doing? What are we going to continue doing? So that would be something that you may want to consider doing. It's because it keeps people engaged. It's going to create some creativity, and it's going to sort of really be ahead of the game post-crisis. The other thing is experiment. Give your team members permission to try out new things. This is a great time to experiment new ways of doing it because we don't need to be perfect. We can make mistakes and learn from them. People are open to that. So experimentation, encourage some experimentation, trying out different ways of dealing with customers, different ways of interacting with each other, different ways of virtual work. And those experiments will generate some buzz, some success stories, because at the end of the day, cultures change through a couple of different mechanisms. One is role modeling, The same way as kids, copy parents. When you find something is successful, the rest of the organization starts copying you. And the second one is success stories, because we like success. And if something seems to be working in this team, other teams will start copying it. And then over time, you find that leads to a cultural change. So those would be a couple of things I would recommend. Create a few cross-functional small teams. Don't make them too big, 5 people. Get them to focus on different aspects of your business, whatever it is that you are responsible for. Secondly, experiment and give your team permission to take baby steps and to come up with recommendations. And then thirdly, celebrate successes. That's why I'm a big believer in Friday team meetings, because we can look back on the week and say, these are 5 things we produced as a team. And that sort of galvanizes the team, encourages the team going into the weekend. And, over time, you find that unfreezing happens, because the first phase of cultural change is what we call unfreezing, which is, unfreezing the big ice block that is your traditional culture. So that is a great question. And again, this is a big, big question, so I'm not doing it justice, but I just wanted to give you some pointers that you can move towards.
No, that's terrific, Homa. And let me move on to a second question. Also, someone in the chat had also kind of posed it in a very similar way. What he had said is, regarding the high degree of ambiguity in the current COVID-19 crisis, what's the best strategy for businesses to respond effectively to market changes and employee concerns, in the next months? And it kind of gets to the second question that we also received, which is like, look, there's multiple crises going on. There's a lot of ambiguity, kind of in the environment. It's not this discrete thing, and that where we know, and you had mentioned earlier about, not knowing having a good sense of the endpoint here. How do you, again, to the point, like, how do you manage in this kind of environment?
So step number 1 is, in an environment of ambiguity, it's like a paradox. You need to provide some clarity. Right? It's interesting. Ambiguity and clarity are 2 sides of the same coin. How do you do that? I suggest you start engaging with your team and do scenario thinking. Let's brainstorm, team. What is the best that could happen to our business post-crisis? And what is the worst case? So there is a spectrum of different scenarios, right? There is the best case that things go back to normal, we'll just see a temporary hiccup, etc., etc., etc. But now let's go to the other end of this extreme. What is the worst case scenario? And this is by talking about it, articulating it, you're going to bring it out of the heads of people, because right now fear is very much in the background. And fear, if it's in our heads and we haven't articulated it, becomes much, much bigger. Whereas if I articulate it and talk about it with my colleagues, then we're creating some level of clarity. This is what we call a hedging strategy. It's like, what is the best case? What is the worst case? What is the middle case? What is our backup plan if the worst case happens? So that would be recommendation number 1. Number 2, you need to have frequent updates. Don't just do this once and leave it at that. Scenarios have to be updated regularly, because right now we're in a very fluid situation. Every day there's new information. And so you need to have sort of, weekly updates. How do we update our scenarios? Because those scenarios provide some anchors of stability, but at the same time, they need to be updated. Otherwise, they're no good. And then thirdly, bring the team along. Don't feel you got to do all this thinking. As I said, one of the biggest pluses of the current situation is our desire to build community. And to build community means, as a leader, think of yourself as a facilitator, as a catalyst for bringing in different points of view as a conversation starter. So I would very much recommend scenario planning and thinking together with your team and updating those on a regular basis.
Great. Thank you. So let me do one more here, and then we'll kind of move on, talk a little bit about super flexibility. And again, for everyone on the line, just keep bringing questions in. We'll do questions all the way to the end. Homa's got a few more slides, but definitely want to leverage her time here to answer your questions. So the third one is and we get this a lot as well. I've talked to various of our clients around this, which is around just sort of like dissension within teams and kind of managing this, where like just got a lot of different reactions to this, and some of it might be based on your own personal resilience. We were talking about that earlier, and some people are very resilient, others, are in different kind of people's home lives. Some are very cavalier about this. Some just can't do anything, and they become paralyzed. So how do we manage, the teams when we're just seeing, it's not consistent, across my team about how everyone's really responding to this?
It's a great question. So first of all, just to tell you about profile of highly effective teams. Apart from very clear goals and roles, highly effective teams have two other features that are really relevant for this question. Number one is the whole notion of clear rules of engagement. Clear rules of engagement, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And the second one has to do with psychological safety, the ability of team members to speak up and express their point of view without feeling that somebody's judging them, somebody's demeaning them, the manager is putting them down, etc. So I would say, let's focus in the context of your question. I would go back to the team, and number one, I would say, look, amongst this team, we seem to have multiple points of view. Some of you are very cavalier, some of you are paralyzed by this, and all of you have probably the right reason based on your personal experience and mindset why you think that way. Why don't we turn something that could be a potential source of friction and conflict into something that could be an advantage for us, which is to really start having a very robust debate about those different scenarios that we were thinking about before. Right? So the ones who are paralyzed might start talking about a lot of the fears and the worst case scenario. The ones who are very cavalier may say, well, this is no big deal, it's going to go away in 3 weeks. But we know that the most effective teams are also diverse teams with a variety of different input. Some companies have started creating, that I know, have started creating team ground rules that are about pro-con debates. So it's about looking at a problem through multiple lenses and not just a single lens. It's not a black and white issue of this is right and this is wrong. It's a question of there are shades of gray. And as a team, the more we can explore shades of gray, the more successful we'll be in the long run, because irrespective of which eventuality happens, we have thought about it. We've been somewhat vaccinated, if you like, because we've thought about these different scenarios ahead of time. So I really encourage you to start thinking of this as an opportunity and not a source of friction. But you have to frame it correctly, and you have to really put a stake in the ground and go to your team and say, we want to acknowledge different points of view, and as a result, create a much more robust team perspective. So we're going to basically have team debate as one of the key ground rules that we're going to put in place. And whatever issue we're looking at, we're going to look at it through these multiple lenses and be prepared for multiple eventualities. Because the cavalier ones may end up being right, or the paralyzed ones may end up being right. I mean, we don't know, right?
That's
where I would go.
Yeah, that's great, and maybe counterintuitive to a lot of folks, in terms of how to do it, and really like the answer there. So, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Homa, for a few more pages that you're going to walk us through on before we wrap up. I think we got about 10 minutes left here. Again, any more questions, just put them in the chat box.
Great, thank you, Adam. So just wanted to tell you a little bit about, my work, which is focused on super flexibility. And by super flexibility, we mean how individuals, teams, and organizations adapt. And the definition of super flexibility is this balancing act. How do we stay stable and predictable and withstand turbulence? But on the other hand, how do we transform adjust, and develop new practices. So for example, for an organization, for a business, you might say our core mission is stable. We're not going to chop and change it. Our core values are stable. We're not going to chop and change it. But we are going to change and adapt our processes. We are going to change and adapt our team practices. So that is the definition of super flexibility. How do you create this balancing act? On the one hand, how do we create stability? And on the other hand, how do we adapt and evolve and transform? And I look at it through these three lenses, but so the next slide really tells you about individual adaptation. And this is what in our course on accelerating change and agility, we focus on these 5 adaptive capabilities, how you stay robust, how you are resilient, how you hedge your bets. Remember the scenario thinking we were talking about? How do you create that agility, and how do you stay versatile, and basically the ability to wear different hats and speak to different audiences based on their needs. So essentially the point here is that we go into obviously much more detail in the course, and there is a diagnostic that goes with it which tells you about your own adaptive DNA. But for the purpose of this conversation, I just like to say that you have to leverage these different capabilities as an individual depending on what you're doing. During the course of one day, you have to be robust, which means, you know, focus on what you control, focus on actions. You need to be resilient and bounce back and deal with setbacks. You need to hedge your bets and think about different scenarios. You need to be fast on your feet depending on the contingency, and you need to be versatile and wear different hats. So what we find, so the first module of the course is basically focused on those 5 different adaptive capabilities. Now, I wanted to do a deep dive on resilience, which is one of the 5. And these are some of the practices that go with resilience. We've talked about many of these, Adam, so I'm not going to belabor it. But when we look at those that have a resilient DNA, these are some of the practices they have in common. Really good at experimenting, baby steps, taking it one day at a time. They're really good at having short deadlines. They break up a task into bite-sized pieces. Instead of saying, this week I will finish this task, they say, this is something I need to finish by the end of the week, but each day I'm going to do that, this little piece of it. They're very good at having a positive mindset, seeing their glass half full, sending those signals of encouragement and hope, but at the same time being realistic, acknowledging the bad news, acknowledging we're in a crisis, acknowledging we're scared and there is fear around. They leverage the collective intelligence of the team and tap into their perspective. They don't take it on just by themselves. And they're very good listeners. They empathize. They don't necessarily agree with everybody, but they are willing to listen and acknowledge that, you know, I totally understand where you're coming from. I don't happen to think that way myself, but I understand your concern and your specific fears. So just wanted to share with you some of those sort of daily practices that really go with more of a resilient DNA. And I just also wanted to share with you some tips about working from home. We've talked about many of these. This is a quick summary, if you like. Virtual routines. I can't tell you how important that is to be predictable, whether it's your team meetings or one-on-ones, certain time, every day, so people can plan their days around that. Mood generation. Are you signaling hope, fear, optimism, pessimism? You need to, of course, be balanced. You don't want to be delusional and just say that, you know, everything will be fantastic, but you do want to balance it and not just talk about bad news, but also talk about good news. You want to keep your team on the same page. I'm a big believer in having 1 or 2 simple visual templates that align the team on the same page. Some of the best teams I know that operate virtually have this you know, single sheet that has got the what, the who, and the when. You know, what are the tasks that we're working on? Who of the team is working on those tasks, and when are those due? Because in a virtual environment, deliverables become critical. And of course, as a leader, you have to wear those different hats. 1 minute you're the boss running the team meeting. The next minute you're the supporter and the empathizer and the listener. The third minute you're a coach, perhaps during your office hours or your one-on-ones, you're helping your team solve a particular problem. You might be a facilitator and so on. So your ability to switch gears and wear different hats, I would say, is one of the most important leadership capabilities that you can experiment with as we go through this crisis, because I think these practices are going to be very important going forward, and not just during the time of this particular crisis. Just to wrap up, and I know that we are running out of time, I hope this session was helpful. As I mentioned, we come from the world of yesterday with certain practices and routines, and we're moving to the world of tomorrow, where I think flexibility and adaptation is going to be key to success. So thank you very much, Adam, and everyone for joining us. I hope this was helpful. We're all in this together, so make sure that you have a positive mindset and you think about what you can do to move things forward. In the words of the famous Charles Darwin, remember that it's not the most successful, the most intelligent, the strongest that ultimately survive. It is always the most adaptable. So I hope this gave you some food for thought. Thank you very much, and back to you, Adam.
Thank you again, Homa, for all of your wonderful insights and for all of the information. Do want to make sure that everybody knows that we will be sending out the recording in follow-up, and as well that Homa is the star of our Accelerating Change Readiness and Agility program offered by ExecOnline in partnership with Berkeley, and that will be our next run of that will be in April. On April 27th is when we're kicking it off, and is a great program for your directors and more senior leaders within your organization. So thank you again, and thank you again to Homa, and wishing everyone a great day. And I am about to run off to, as part of my own virtual routine, to recess with my 11-year-old daughter. And thanks again for attending the webinar today.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.